There are moments that don't knock. They open your front door like they still have the key. Frank Donovan had said that once, years ago, to nobody in particular, just to the quiet kitchen and the ticking clock that always sounded louder after 60. But on this Tuesday morning, at 69, he wasn't thinking about lines like that. He was thinking about the grocery list stuck under a magnet on the fridge, the mild ache in his left knee, and whether the coffee maker had finally given up for good. The house was modest, clean, and familiar in that way a place becomes when you've lived in it long enough to stop noticing the scuffs on the baseboards. Outside, the neighborhood was doing its usual slow dance. A sprinkler clicking, a delivery truck rumbling past, a dog barking twice like it had a schedule. Frank wiped his hands on a dish towel and started toward the hallway, already planning the small errands that filled his days now. Pharmacy, post office, maybe a quick stop for gas if the price wasn't ridiculous. Then the doorbell rang. Not a cheerful, quick ding-dong. Just one firm press, steady, like someone who didn't want to be ignored. Frank paused. Most people called first. The grandkids texted emojis. The neighbors waved from across the lawn. Nobody really rang the bell anymore. He walked to the front door anyway, barefoot on the cool wood floor, and glanced through the peephole. At first, his mind refused to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. A woman stood on the porch, posture straight, hands folded like she was holding herself together. Her hair was silver now, cut neatly at her jaw. She wore a simple navy coat despite the mild weather, and she looked like someone who had practiced this moment in the mirror 100 times. Next to her stood a man in a gray suit, holding a thin folder against his chest. He looked professional, patient, the kind of person who charged by the hour. Frank's heartbeat didn't race. It stopped, like a car stalling in the middle of an intersection. Because the woman's face, even with time etched into it, even with the softened edges of age, still carried something unmistakable. The shape of her smile, the way her eyes held light. A memory so sharp it felt like a smell, like summer air and cheap cologne. And a song on the radio you never forgot. Frank's fingers tightened around the doorknob. He could have stepped back. He could have pretended he wasn't home. He could have let the moment pass like everything else he'd let pass. Instead, he opened the door. The woman lifted her chin, and her voice came out calm but thin, like it had to squeeze through a lifetime first. "Frank," she said, as if she'd never stopped saying his name. The man beside her didn't speak. He just watched, careful, ready. Frank's mouth went dry. He stared at her the way a person stares at a photograph that suddenly moves. "Claire," he managed, and even that sounded strange, like a word from a language he hadn't spoken in decades. Her eyes flickered, and for a second she looked relieved, almost grateful, like she'd been afraid he wouldn't recognize her at all. Then her expression tightened, and she took a breath that made her shoulders rise and fall. "I'm sorry," she said, and the apology didn't sound small. It sounded heavy, like it had been carried a long way. She glanced at the man with the folder, then back at Frank, and her next words landed like a quiet thunderclap. "Frank, I have to tell you the truth today." Frank did not invite them in right away, not because he was trying to be rude, but because his body had forgotten how to move when the past suddenly showed up on his porch. Claire stood there with the same steady posture, and the man beside her held his folder like it mattered, like whatever was inside had weight. Frank swallowed, glanced over Claire's shoulder at the quiet street, and then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, and his own voice surprised him, sounding smaller than he wanted. Claire walked in first, careful, like she did not want to disturb anything. The man followed, polite and quiet. Frank closed the door and turned the deadbolt out of pure habit, then realized how that must look and stopped himself from apologizing. He led them to the living room where sunlight fell across a couch that had seen too many baseball games and too many silent evenings. Claire remained standing. The man remained standing too, as if sitting would make this too personal. Frank gestured toward the couch anyway. "You can sit," he offered. Claire shook her head once. "I do not think I can," she said. Frank's heart thumped again, and he forced himself to breathe, slow and even. "Claire," he began, and then he stopped. He did not know which version of her he was speaking to, the girl from his memories or the woman in front of him. The air between them felt crowded with words that had nowhere to land. The man finally spoke, his tone gentle but formal. "Mr. Donovan, my name is Thomas Reed. I am here at Ms. Bennett's request." Frank stared at him, then back at Claire. "Bennett," Frank repeated, as if tasting the name. You married? Claire's eyes flicked down for a moment, then up. Yes, she said simply. Frank nodded, because he did not know what else to do. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but he also wanted to run back to the kitchen and pretend the doorbell never rang. Instead, he said the first thing that felt real. Why are you here? Claire took a breath, long and careful. Because I ran out of time to keep pretending I did the right thing, she said. The words hit Frank in a way he did not expect, like a cold hand on the back of his neck. Thomas Reed opened his folder slightly, but did not pull anything out yet. He waited for Claire, like this was her story to tell. Frank's eyes drifted to the clock on the wall, the second hand moving in tiny, steady steps, as if time had not just cracked open. Claire's voice softened. I did not come to ruin your life, she said. I did not come for money. I did not come because I am lonely. I came because something happened, and it left a question in the world that never got answered. Frank frowned. What question? He asked, and his mouth felt numb. Claire looked at the small table by the window where a framed photo of Frank's daughter and grandkids sat smiling, the kind of picture people put out to prove they have a full life. Claire's gaze lingered there just long enough for Frank to notice. Then she looked back at him. Do you remember the letter? She asked. Frank blinked. A letter. The word alone brought back a flash of a mailbox, a summer afternoon, him checking it like it was a lifeline. He felt suddenly 17 again, waiting for proof that she was coming back. Frank's hands curled into fists at his sides. I never got any letter, he said, and his voice was sharper than he intended. Claire's face tightened, and her eyes turned glossy but did not spill. I wrote it, she said. I wrote more than one. Frank shook his head slowly, as if denying it could change what he heard. Then why did you disappear? He asked. Claire's lips parted, and she hesitated, like the truth had thorns. Thomas Reed shifted his weight, and the folder in his hand made a soft paper sound. Claire finally whispered, because I believed you did not want me anymore. Frank stared at her, and for the first time, anger and grief rose together, twisting in his chest. That is not possible, he said, and he did not know if he was talking to her or to time itself. Claire held his gaze. It is possible, she said, and today, I can prove it. Frank did not realize he was holding his breath until his chest started to ache. Claire's last words hung in the room like a note that would not fade, and the quiet suddenly felt louder than any shouting ever could. Thomas Reed finally opened the folder and slid out a single envelope inside a clear protective sleeve, the kind used for documents that matter. The paper looked old but cared for, edges slightly softened with time. Frank's eyes locked on it the way they used to lock on the mailbox at the end of his parents' driveway. Claire's hands trembled, just a little, and she clasped them tighter, as if to hide it. I kept it, she said. Not the originals. I did not have the originals. But I kept what I could. Thomas turned the sleeve so Frank could see without touching. At the top, in neat handwriting, was a return address Frank recognized in an instant. Claire's mother's old house on Maple Street. Below it, his own name, written the way Claire used to write it in the margins of her notebook, the way she wrote it on the paper cup the night they shared a milkshake and talked about leaving town together after graduation. Frank's throat tightened. He stared at the letters until they blurred. That is my name, he said like. He needed to anchor himself to something obvious. Yes, Claire replied. And that is your address from back then. Frank's fingers reached out before he decided to move. Thomas gently placed the sleeve on the coffee table, leaving space like this was sacred ground. Frank leaned over it, and the smell of paper and plastic mixed with the familiar scent of his own home. It did not make sense. It could not make sense. If you wrote me, Frank said slowly, then why did I never get it? Claire swallowed. Because it was not mailed the way I thought, she said. Frank looked up sharply. What does that mean? Claire's eyes flicked to the hallway, as if she could see the past standing there, listening. It means I gave it to someone I trusted, she said. And that was my mistake. Frank sat down without meaning to, the couch catching him like it had been waiting. The room tilted in a subtle way, like the foundation under his memories had cracked. Thomas Reed cleared his throat softly. Mr. Donovan, he said, Ms. Bennett asked me to be here because there are documents, and there is a statement. She did not want this to sound like a story that could be dismissed. Frank stared at Thomas as if the man had just spoken from another world. A statement, Frank repeated. About what? Claire answered before Thomas could. About what happened after I disappeared, she said, and her voice was steadier now, as if she had decided she could not afford to fall apart. Frank's mind flashed to that summer, to the last day he saw her, to the way she promised she would call, to the way he waited by the phone until his mother told him to stop wearing a groove into the kitchen floor. He remembered standing outside the old diner at 9 at night, looking up and down the road, convinced her car would pull in any second. He remembered the humiliation of pretending he did not care when his friends teased him, and the ache of not knowing if he had been foolish or simply loved someone who left. "I thought you chose to forget me," Frank said, and his voice broke at the end, betraying him. Claire's eyes shone again. "I thought you did," she whispered. "I thought you were the one who made the choice." Frank's hands pressed into his knees. "Who took the letter?" he asked, and he hated how desperate he sounded. Claire looked at Thomas, and Thomas nodded once, like a cue. Claire drew in a breath and said, "My mother." The word landed hard, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. A mother. A familiar person. The kind of person who could change your life without ever raising her voice. Frank's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Claire continued, forcing each word out carefully. "She told me she would mail it," Claire said. "She told me she would not stand in the way. And then she never sent it." Frank felt heat rise behind his eyes. "Why would she do that?" he demanded. Claire's voice dropped. "Because she read it," she said. "And because she decided she knew what was best for me." Frank stared at the envelope again, and a single thought cut through everything else, sharp and unavoidable. If one letter could be stopped, then how many other truths had been stopped too? Frank stared at Claire as if she had just pointed to a crack in the wall of his life that had been there all along, hidden behind framed photos and routine. "Your mother," he repeated, and the words sounded too small for what they meant. Claire nodded once, slow, like each movement cost her something. "She thought she was protecting me," Claire said. "She thought you were a dream I would grow out of." Frank let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, except there was nothing funny in it. He looked down at the envelope again, at the careful handwriting that had survived decades, and he felt a sudden, unreasonable urge to rewind time and stand at that old mailbox again, as if he could catch the letter midair. "So you left because you thought I did not care," Frank said, his voice low. "And I spent years thinking you did not care." Claire's eyes softened, and her shoulders finally sagged a little, as if she had been holding that weight in place since she was 19. "Yes," she said. "And it did not just change that summer. It changed everything after." Frank's jaw tightened. "Then why come now?" he asked. "Why show up at my door after all this time with a lawyer and a folder like I am some kind of case file?" Thomas Reed lifted a hand slightly, polite, as if to reassure Frank without interrupting Claire's moment. Claire answered anyway. "Because I found proof," she said. "And because the truth does not stay buried forever, Frank. It only waits." Frank leaned back into the couch, the fabric rough under his palms. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. He glanced at the family photo by the window again and thought about how he had built a life out of what was left. He had married later than most of his friends. He had tried to be a good husband. He had tried to be a steady father. He had done the responsible things, the normal things, the things people praised you for. But there had always been a quiet corner in him that never quite shut the door on Claire. He had told himself it was nostalgia. He had told himself it was harmless. Now it felt like unfinished business knocking over furniture. Claire moved closer to the coffee table and touched the sleeve lightly with 2 fingers, careful not to smudge time. "After my mother died," she said, "I was cleaning out her attic. I was not looking for you. I was looking for old tax papers and baby clothes and boxes you cannot throw away because you feel guilty." Frank listened, unable to look away. Claire continued. "There was a tin box taped shut. Inside were things she kept like trophies. Photos, letters, even a pressed flower from my prom corsage. And there were copies of my letters to you." Frank's throat tightened. "Copies," he said. "How?" Thomas Reed spoke softly. "Mr. Donovan, some people typed letters and used carbon paper. Others made photocopies later. In this case, Ms. Bennett's mother kept the originals of several items and left behind notes that explain her actions." Frank's eyes snapped to Thomas. "Notes," Frank said, and the word came out rough. "She wrote down why she did it?" Claire nodded. "She did," Claire said, and she sounded both angry and exhausted. "She wrote that you were not good enough. She wrote that you were going nowhere. She wrote that I would thank her one day." Frank felt a hot sting behind his eyes, not just for himself, but for the kid he used to be, the kid who worked weekends at the gas station, and still showed up with a clean shirt to take Claire to the diner. I would have given her a lifetime of proof, Frank said quietly. Claire's lips trembled, then steadied. I know, she said. That is why I am here. Frank swallowed hard. And the man with the folder, he said, nodding toward Thomas. What is this really about? Thomas Reed opened the folder again and finally pulled out a single sheet with crisp edges, far newer than the envelope. Mr. Donovan, he said carefully, there is one more piece to this that Ms. Bennett wants you to hear from her directly. But I need you to understand something first. This is not only about a letter that never arrived. There is a consequence that did arrive. Claire's gaze held Frank's, and in that look was urgency, fear, and a kind of courage that had taken her 50 years to grow. Frank, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When I left, I was not only leaving you. Frank felt his stomach drop, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden sense that the floor under his memories was about to give way. The room seemed too bright, too ordinary for what Claire was about to say. He looked at her face, searching for any hint that this was a misunderstanding, a dramatic phrase that would soften into something manageable. Claire did not soften. She held his gaze like she had promised herself she would not look away this time. When I left, Claire repeated, slower now, I was not only leaving you. Frank's mouth went dry. He heard himself ask, what do you mean? And hated how small the question sounded. Claire's hands finally unclasped, then clasped again, fingers pressing into each other. I was 19, she said. I was scared. I was angry. And I was carrying a truth I did not know how to say out loud. Frank's heart hammered once, hard enough that he felt it in his ears. Claire, he said, and his voice came out rough, say it. She took a breath that trembled on the way in. I was pregnant, she said. The words did not echo, but they filled everything anyway. Frank stared at her, blinking like his eyes had stopped working. The living room, the couch, the family photo by the window, the sunlight on the carpet, all of it turned into background noise. He heard the ticking clock again, louder than before, and for a second he wondered if time had been mocking him all along. That is not, Frank started, then stopped because he realized he did not know what he was trying to say. That it was not possible, that it could not be his, that it was too late. Thomas Reed shifted his stance, still quiet, still respectful, like he understood this was a moment people remember for the rest of their lives. Claire's voice stayed steady, but her eyes shimmered. I did not know at first, she said. I found out right after my mother took the letter. I thought I could fix it if I told her. I thought she would help me. She did not. Frank swallowed hard. His hands gripped his knees so tightly his knuckles went pale. Why did you not tell me? He asked, and the words came out sharp, not because he wanted to hurt her, but because the pain had nowhere else to go. Claire's chin lifted, stubborn and familiar. I tried, she said. I begged her to let me call you. She told me you would ruin your future. She told me you would resent me. She told me you would leave. And then she did something I could not undo. Frank's eyes narrowed. What did she do? He demanded. Claire glanced at Thomas, and Thomas finally took a step closer to the coffee table, careful, like he was approaching a fragile object. Mr. Donovan, Thomas said gently, Ms. Bennett is not here to accuse you of anything. She is here to give you the truth, supported by records, because the situation now requires clarity. Frank barely heard him. His focus was locked on Claire. Claire, Frank said, his voice lower now. Did you have the baby? Claire nodded once, and the nod was so small it looked like it hurt. Yes, she said. Frank's breath hitched. A son? He asked, then immediately hated himself for guessing. A daughter? Claire's mouth trembled, then steadied. A daughter, she said. Frank's head spun. He tried to do math he had not done in decades. He tried to imagine a life that could fit inside this new fact, and nothing fit. His eyes flashed again to the photo by the window, to his grandchildren's bright smiles, and his mind fractured into a dozen directions at once. Where is she? Frank asked, and his voice cracked. Claire's gaze dropped for the first time, and when she looked back up, there was something in her expression Frank had never seen before, regret mixed with urgency. She is alive, Claire said quickly, as if she knew that was the first fear people had. She is safe. She has a family, and she does not know you exist. Frank's chest tightened so hard he thought he might stand up just to breathe. Then why now? He demanded again, louder this time. Claire's eyes held his, and she whispered, Because she is asking questions. Thomas Reed slid one more document from the folder, not toward Frank yet, but into view. Mr. Donovan, he said, there has been a request for confirmation, and there is a deadline attached to it. Frank stared at the paper like it was a doorway he was afraid to walk through. What kind of deadline? Frank asked. Claire answered in a voice that was almost pleading. The kind that means if we do not do this now, she said, we may never get another chance to do it right. Frank stared at the document like it might bite him, then forced his eyes to focus on the words instead of the fear. Thomas Reed kept the page angled just enough for Frank to read the bold line near the top. Request for paternity confirmation. Frank's stomach turned. So this is about a test, Frank said, and he hated that his voice sounded like he was already being judged. Thomas Reed nodded once. A simple, non-invasive test, Thomas said calmly. A cheek swab. No needles. No hospital visits required. The request is voluntary, but the timing is not flexible. Frank looked from Thomas to Claire. Why is she asking now? Frank demanded. Claire pressed her lips together, as if she had promised herself she would not cry in Frank's living room. Because she found something, Claire said. Something with your name. Frank's hands lifted in a helpless gesture. My name was never in her life, Frank said. I did not even know she existed. Claire nodded quickly. I know, she said. That is the point. She found it without me giving it to her. Frank's mind raced. He tried to imagine a grown woman in her 50s opening a box, finding a thread that led back to him, and pulling on it until it snapped the past wide open. The thought was dizzying. What did she find? Frank asked. Thomas Reed's fingers tapped the edge of the folder once, a quiet signal that there was a careful order to this. Mr. Donovan, Thomas said, Ms. Bennett's daughter requested information after receiving a set of personal effects from her late grandmother's estate. Frank blinked. Her grandmother, Frank repeated, and the pieces started to align in a way that made him feel sick. Claire's mother. The same woman who had intercepted the letter. The same woman who wrote notes about choosing Claire's future. Frank's jaw clenched. So even after she died, Frank said, she still had her hands on this. Claire's shoulders tensed. Yes, Claire admitted. And that is why I could not keep pretending it was just a sad love story. It was not. It was a decision. It was control. Frank exhaled slowly through his nose, trying not to let anger swallow the room. He looked at the family photo by the window again, and his mind flashed to every birthday he had celebrated, every school play he attended, every quiet Sunday morning he made pancakes, because that was what good fathers did. And then he imagined a parallel set of birthdays, a parallel little girl blowing out candles somewhere else, growing up without ever knowing his face. The thought made his chest tighten. Does she hate me? Frank asked, and the question slipped out before he could stop it. Claire's eyes widened, then softened. She does not, Claire said quickly. She is not angry at you. She is confused. She is hurt, but not at you. She thinks she was lied to, and she is right. Thomas Reed added. She requested confirmation before she makes any contact. She wants facts first. She wants to be sure she is not building hope on a rumor. Frank stared at Thomas. And the deadline? Frank asked again. Thomas's expression stayed professional, but his voice softened. There is a legal matter connected to the estate, Thomas said. Certain documents must be filed within 30 days of notification. If paternity is confirmed, it impacts how some items are distributed. If it is not confirmed, the matter closes. Frank's head snapped back to Claire. Estate, he said. You said you did not come for money. Claire's cheeks flushed, not with guilt, but with frustration. I did not, she said. She did not either. The estate is not a fortune. It is a house, some savings, family keepsakes. But the paperwork forced the question into the open. Frank's throat tightened. So I am a checkbox, Frank said bitterly. A line on a form. Claire stepped forward, finally close enough that Frank could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the proof of decades lived without him. No, she said firmly. You are not a checkbox. You are her father, if the truth says you are. And if you are, then this is not about inheritance. It is about identity. Frank looked down at his hands, hands that had fixed leaky faucets and mowed lawns and carried grocery bags, hands that had never once held that child. What is her name? Frank asked, his voice barely holding together. Claire hesitated for half a beat, then said, her name is Emily. The name landed softly, and yet it knocked something loose inside Frank that had been locked up for half a century. He whispered it once, as if saying it could make it real. Emily. Thomas Reed gently slid a second page forward, and this one had fewer legal words and more personal weight, a printed email. At the bottom was a sentence that made Frank's breath catch. I do not want to blame anyone. I just want the truth before it is too late. Frank read Emily's sentence again, and each time it landed differently, like a stone skipping across water that had been calm for too long. I do not want to blame anyone. I just want the truth before it is too late. The words were polite, even gentle, but they carried a quiet force that made Frank's chest tighten. He pictured a woman he had never met sitting at her kitchen table, maybe with a cup of coffee cooling beside her, staring at a screen and wondering if her life had been built on someone else's decision. Frank looked up at Claire, and he could not tell which emotion he wanted to feel first. Anger came easy. Grief came right behind it. And somewhere underneath both was a strange, almost frightening spark of hope. So she knows my name, Frank said, voice low. But she does not know me. Claire nodded. She knows a name, Claire said. She knows there was a gap in her story. She does not know the person. Frank's gaze drifted toward the hallway again, toward the coats hanging by the door, the umbrella stand, the small ordinary things that had always meant safety to him. Now even his own house felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to a man with a different past. Why did you not tell her earlier? Frank asked. Why did you let her grow up without answers? Claire flinched, and Thomas Reed's expression softened as if he expected the question. Claire answered anyway. Because I told myself I was doing what my mother taught me, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I told myself silence was stability. I told myself that opening the past would only hurt people. Frank shook his head slowly. And did it? He asked. Claire's eyes filled but held. Yes, she said. It hurt me. It hurt her. It hurt you, even without you knowing why. Frank pressed his tongue against his teeth, fighting the urge to stand up and pace, to move the energy out of his body. He did not. He stayed still, because stillness was the only thing keeping him from breaking. You married, Frank said, more statement than question. Did he know? Claire looked down for a moment. He knew I had a painful past, she said. He did not know the details. And he did not know about you. Frank swallowed. And Emily, he said, tasting the name again. She grew up thinking he was her father? Claire lifted her head. She grew up with a father, Claire said carefully. A good man who loved her. I will not take that from him. But biology and love are different things, Frank. Both can matter. Frank's eyes stung, and he blinked hard. I do not want to take anything, Frank said. I do not want to show up like a storm and knock down her life. Thomas Reed finally spoke again, voice even. Mr. Donovan, that is precisely why the request is for confirmation first. There will be no surprise visits. No sudden introductions. Emily asked for a clear answer so she can decide what she wants, if anything. Frank looked at Thomas. So she is the one in control, Frank said. Thomas nodded. Yes, Thomas said. She is. And she is approaching this with care. Frank leaned forward and stared at the envelope on the table again, the one Claire had written to him decades ago. A letter that could have changed everything. A letter that never arrived. Frank felt something rise in him that was not just anger at Claire's mother, not just regret over lost time. It was a fierce, protective instinct he did not know he still had. 30 days, Frank said, eyes on the document. And after that, the door closes. Thomas Reed confirmed. The filing window closes. Not life, but the legal matter, yes. Frank rubbed his palms over his knees, then looked back at Claire. You brought this here, Frank said. You could have mailed it. You could have sent an email. You could have let the lawyer handle it. Claire's voice lowered. I came because I needed to see your face when you heard her name, she said. I needed to know if you were still the kind of man I believed in when I was 19. Frank's throat tightened, and for a moment, he was furious at how that sounded like a test of his character, as if he had not already lost enough. Then he saw the fear in Claire's eyes, the same fear she must have carried for decades, and his anger shifted into something more complicated. Claire, Frank said quietly, I am not 19 anymore. Claire nodded. Neither am I, she whispered. The room fell silent again, and Frank realized this was the crossroads he had avoided his whole life. The point where you either protect your peace by denying the truth, or you accept the truth and let it change you. He looked at the email again, at Emily's careful words, and he felt his voice steady as he said, "If I do this test, what happens next?" Thomas Reed answered, "If paternity is confirmed, Emily will be informed. Then she will decide whether she wants contact, and how. It can be as simple as a letter, a phone call, or nothing at all." Frank nodded slowly, absorbing the reality that he could finally gain a daughter and still never hear her voice. He looked at Claire one more time and asked, "And what do you want?" Claire's answer came without hesitation, but it was not a demand. It was a confession. "I want her to have the truth," she said, "and I want you to have the chance that was stolen from you, even if it is late." Frank stared at Claire after she said stolen, and something in him finally snapped into clarity, not rage, but resolve. He had spent decades making peace with half-answers, telling himself that life was just a series of doors that closed and you learned to live in the hallway. Now a door had reopened, and behind it was a name he could not stop repeating in his head. Emily. He stood up slowly, not dramatic, just steady, and walked to the window where the family photo sat. He picked it up and looked at the faces, his daughter's smile, the grandkids with their missing teeth and bright eyes, the proof that he had loved and been loved. Then he set the frame back down carefully, like he was placing his old life back where it belonged. He turned toward Thomas Reed. "What do I have to do today?" Frank asked. Thomas's posture remained calm, but his eyes showed a flicker of respect. "If you are willing, I can provide a kit," Thomas said. "It takes a few minutes. I can witness the chain of custody, and the sample can be sent overnight. Results typically return within a week." Frank nodded once, then looked at Claire. "I need to ask you something," Frank said. Claire straightened, bracing. Frank's voice stayed controlled, but there was steel under it now. "Did you ever try to come back before?" he asked. Claire's eyes widened slightly, and her answer came softer. "I did," she said. "Twice." Frank's chest tightened, and he pressed. Claire swallowed. "The first time, I drove past your parents' house," she said. "I sat in my car for 20 minutes and could not get out. I saw your mother in the yard, and I panicked. I told myself you had moved on, that you would hate me, that I would ruin everything." Frank exhaled slowly, tasting the bitter truth of how fear becomes a decision. "And the second time?" he asked. Claire's voice dropped. "The second time was after Emily turned 18, she said. "I found an old phone book and called the number I remembered. It was disconnected. I took it as a sign." Frank shook his head, not in disbelief, but in frustration at how the universe did not hand people signs. It handed them silence and waited to see what they did with it. "So we both let silence win," Frank said. Claire nodded, tears finally spilling now, quiet and unapologetic. "Yes," she whispered. Frank looked away for a second, because seeing her cry made him feel 19 again and 69 at the same time, and he could not afford to fall apart. He looked back at Thomas. "Bring the kit," Frank said. Thomas opened the folder and pulled out a small sealed package and a form. "Before we proceed," Thomas said, "I need your consent and identification." Frank reached for his wallet on the side table. His hands trembled slightly, and he hated that, so he steadied them by pressing his thumb against the leather until the shake stopped. He handed Thomas his driver's license. Thomas checked it, nodded, and set it aside. Frank took the pen when Thomas offered it and signed where indicated, the ink forming his name like a promise made late, but still real. Claire watched him with an expression that held relief and fear together, like she was afraid the act of confirming the truth would unleash consequences neither of them could predict. Frank held up a hand toward her, not harsh, just firm. "Claire," he said, "this is not me forgiving everything. Not yet. This is me refusing to be robbed again." Claire nodded, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "I understand," she said. Thomas opened the sealed package and handed Frank the swab, explaining simply how to do it. Frank followed the instructions carefully, as if precision could protect him from emotion. When he finished, Thomas sealed it, labeled it, and placed it into a prepaid envelope. Frank watched every step, because trust had become a fragile thing in this room. Thomas held the envelope up slightly. "I will take this directly to the carrier," Thomas said. Frank nodded, then looked at Claire again. "When the results come," Frank said, voice steady, "I want to be the one to write the first letter to her. Not you. Not the lawyer. Me." Claire's lips parted, surprised. "Frank," she said softly, "she might not want." Frank cut her off gently. "I know," he said, "but she deserves to hear from the man she has never met, in his own words. If she chooses to never reply, that will be her choice. But the truth will not be filtered through someone else's fear ever again. Claire nodded slowly, and something in her face eased, like she had been waiting her whole life to hear him say that. Thomas gathered the documents and the envelope, preparing to leave. Frank walked them to the door, and before Claire stepped onto the porch, she turned back. "Frank," she said, voice trembling again, "I am sorry." Frank held her gaze. "So am I," he said honestly. "But sorry does not change the past. Truth is the only thing we have left that can." Frank closes the door after Claire and Thomas leave and stands with his hand on the lock, needing something solid to hold on to. The house is quiet again, but the quiet feels sharper, pressing in from the corners. He returns to the living room and stares at the coffee table where the old envelope still rests in its sleeve, like it has been waiting 50 years to be seen. He lifts it carefully and studies Claire's handwriting, so young and hopeful, and a physical grief hits him for the boy he once was. The boy who kept checking the mailbox and pretending it did not hurt when nothing arrived. He sits and lets the truth settle where uncertainty used to live. Over the next week, time becomes strange. Some hours drag endlessly while other days disappear without warning. He moves through routine on autopilot, pouring cereal, rinsing a mug, folding a towel, then freezes when the same thought keeps striking him. He has a daughter. He says it out loud once, just to hear it, and it feels both unreal and undeniable. He tries to imagine Emily, but his mind produces only shifting, invented faces, so he stops forcing an image and focuses on the one thing he can control, writing the letter he promised. He pulls out a yellow legal pad, the one he normally uses for everyday notes, and stares at the blank page until his eyes burn. He writes her name, crosses it out, tries a more formal version, crosses that out too, then finally settles on "Hello, Emily," because it is simple and true. He avoids excuses and blame. Instead, he writes plain truths. He did not know she existed. If he had known, he would have shown up. He understands she may feel angry, confused, or cautious. She owes him nothing, not even a reply. The line that shakes his hand is the one that matters most. He is here now, and he will not disappear again. When the test results arrive, he cannot open them immediately. He makes coffee first, as if it might give him the steadiness he needs. He hovers over his phone, letting the screen dim, waking it again, until he finally opens the message. The result is simple and blunt, confirmed. It feels like the universe signing a contract without emotion. His shoulders sink as if he has been holding himself upright for decades. He does not celebrate or fall apart. He just stands there and lets out a quiet sob that surprises him. Less about getting what he wanted, more about realizing what he lost and what he might still be allowed to find. He reads the word again, whispers, "Emily," and this time her name feels less like a stranger and more like responsibility. He rewrites his draft carefully, slower and steadier, then seals it in an envelope and holds it like something fragile that can change a life. He calls Thomas Reed and asks him to tell Emily the truth is confirmed, to tell her he wrote to her, and to tell her she can take all the time she needs. After the call, he looks at the family photo again and understands the results are not the ending. They are only the beginning of accountability, patience, and whatever relationship Emily chooses. He opens the front door to the afternoon light. The street looks the same, but he feels different. For the first time in decades, the future does not feel like something that simply happens to him. It feels like something he can step into, one honest sentence at a time.